When 16-year-old Jake Matthews rolled his wheelchair through the gates of Riverside Skate Park that sunny afternoon, the laughter started immediately. The other skaters stopped what they were doing, pointing and snickering at the quiet kid who dared to bring his chair to their sacred concrete playground. They saw weakness. They saw someone who didn't belong. They saw an easy target for their cruel jokes and mocking stares. But what they didn't see was the fire burning in Jake's determined eyes, or the countless hours he'd spent perfecting something extraordinary in his garage. They had no idea that this unassuming teenager was about to pull off a backflip that would silence every doubter, shatter every assumption, and change everything forever. What happened next left everyone absolutely speechless. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Jake Matthews hadn't always been the kid in the wheelchair. 2 years ago, he was Riverside High's golden boy, the star athlete who dominated every sport he touched. Basketball, soccer, track and field. Jake excelled at them all with a natural grace that made everything look effortless. Coaches called him a prodigy. Teammates looked up to him. College scouts had already started calling, even though he was only 14. Then came that rainy November night when everything changed forever. Jake was riding home from basketball practice with his best friend Tyler when a drunk driver ran a red light. The impact crushed Jake's spine, stealing the use of his legs but never breaking his spirit. While other kids his age worried about homework and dating, Jake faced months of grueling physical therapy, learning to navigate a world that suddenly seemed designed to keep him out. But the accident couldn't kill what burned deepest in Jake's heart. This speed, his love for movement, for speed, for the rush of defying gravity and pushing limits. From his hospital bed, he watched skateboarding videos on his phone, studying every trick, every technique, every moment of pure athletic poetry. His mother Sarah understood this burning passion. She saw how his eyes lit up when he talked about adapting extreme sports for his wheelchair, how he sketched modifications and dreamed of possibilities that others couldn't see. He needs this, Sarah had argued with her husband David just that morning. He needs to feel alive again, to chase something that makes his heart race. David worried about safety, about more injuries, about their son facing even more disappointment. But Sarah knew better. She recognized the determined gleam in Jake's eyes, the same fire that had made him unstoppable before the accident. That flame hadn't died in the wreckage. It had only grown stronger, more focused, more desperate to prove that some barriers existed only in people's minds. So when Jake asked to go to Riverside Skate Park, Sarah grabbed her car keys without hesitation. She would drive him anywhere he needed to chase his dreams, even if the whole world told him those dreams were impossible. Because she knew her son, and she knew that Jake Matthews was just getting started. Every night for the past 8 months, Jake had transformed the family garage into his private training facility. While his parents slept and the neighborhood fell quiet, he would slip out of the house and wheel himself into that cramped space filled with old boxes and forgotten Christmas decorations. There, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and dust, Jake had been quietly revolutionizing what was possible. His wheelchair wasn't the standard hospital-issued model anymore. Jake had spent countless hours researching, designing, and modifying every component with an engineer's precision and an athlete's obsession. He'd reinforced the frame with lightweight aluminum struts, upgraded the wheels to high-performance bearings that could handle impacts, and added specialized grips and footrests that would hold him secure during the most extreme maneuvers. The chair had become an extension of his body, a piece of equipment as finely tuned as any professional skateboard. Jake practiced on homemade ramps constructed from plywood and PVC pipes, starting with basic movements and gradually building towards something that most people would consider impossible. He studied physics textbooks to understand rotation and momentum, watched endless slow-motion videos of gymnasts and skateboarders, and calculated angles with the methodical patience of someone who refused to accept limitations. His younger sister Emma was his only confidant, the one person who truly understood what her brother was attempting. While their parents worried and their father spoke cautiously about accepting new realities, Emma saw the old Jake burning brighter than ever. She would sneak into the garage some nights, watching in amazement as her brother defied every assumption about what someone in a wheelchair could accomplish. "They're going to lose their minds when they see what you can do," Emma would whisper, her eyes shining with pride and excitement. Jake never spoke about proving anyone wrong or seeking revenge against a world that had written him off. His motivation ran deeper than anger or bitterness. He trained with the quiet intensity of someone who knew that limitations existed mainly in people's minds, that the human spirit could adapt and overcome in ways that defied conventional wisdom. Every failed attempt, every bruising fall, every moment of doubt only strengthened his resolve. Because Jake Matthews wasn't training to show off or seek attention. He was training to remind the world that some dreams refuse to die, no matter what tries to kill them. Riverside Skate Park stretched before Jake like a concrete coliseum, its massive bowls and towering ramps casting long shadows in the afternoon sunday. The sound hit him first, the sharp crack of wheels against concrete, the scraping of metal rails, the rhythmic swoosh of skateboards carving through the air. This wasn't some quiet neighborhood park where beginners practiced their kickflips. This was hallowed ground for the city's most skilled skaters, a place where only the fearless and talented dared to test themselves. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his wheelchair's push rims, but he forced himself to roll forward through the entrance gate. His modified chair looked foreign among the scattered skateboards and BMX bikes, its reinforced frame and specialized components marking him as an outsider before he'd even moved 10 feet into the park. The skaters were magnificent and terrifying. A girl with bright purple hair launched herself 15 feet into the air from a half-pipe, spinning her board beneath her feet with casual perfection. Two teenagers flowed through the snake run like liquid mercury, their movements so smooth and natural that they barely seemed human. Every trick landed with precision, every line executed with the confidence that came from years of dedication and countless bruises. Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs. These weren't the YouTube videos he'd studied in his garage. This was real, immediate, and infinitely more intimidating than he'd imagined. The doubt crept in like fog. What was he thinking coming here? What made him believe he belonged in this world of gravity-defying athletes who moved with such effortless grace? But then he remembered Emma's words. The months of secret training, the countless nights he'd pushed himself to master what others deemed impossible. He straightened his shoulders and rolled deeper into the park, searching for an empty section where he could begin. That's when he noticed the whispers starting. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as skaters caught sight of him. Heads turned, fingers pointed discreetly, and hushed voices carried fragments of questions and assumptions. Is that guy serious? What's he doing here? Somebody's lost. The weight of their stares pressed down on him like a physical force, but Jake kept moving forward. He'd expected this reaction. He'd prepared himself for the judgment, the confusion, the immediate assumption that he didn't belong. But preparation didn't make it easier to bear the collective gaze of dozens of skeptical teenagers who saw his wheelchair as proof of his limitations rather than evidence of his determination. Chad Stevens ruled Riverside Skate Park with the arrogance of someone who'd never been challenged. At 18, he was older than most of the regulars, with perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive designer skating gear, and a signature black tank top that showed off the tattoos running down his muscled arms. He commanded respect through intimidation, his crew of loyal followers hanging on his every word like disciples worshiping their king. When Chad spotted Jake rolling slowly across the concrete, he dropped his skateboard with a deliberate clatter that echoed through the park. The sound was like a dinner bell for drama, and conversations ceased as skaters turned to watch what everyone knew was coming. Chad's entourage gathered behind him, Tyler, Marcus, and Devon, their faces already twisting into the same sneering expressions that mirrored their leader's contempt. Well, Chad called out, his voice carrying across the park with theatrical authority. What do we have here? He approached Jake with the casual swagger of someone who owned every inch of concrete beneath his feet. Are you lost, buddy? Because last time I checked, this was a skate park, not a hospital. Jake stopped his wheelchair and looked up calmly, meeting Chad's mocking gaze without flinching. "I'm not lost," he said simply, his voice steady despite the dozens of eyes watching the confrontation unfold. "I came here to skate." Chad's laugh was sharp and cruel, designed to cut deep. "Skate? With that?" He gestured dismissively at Jake's wheelchair, as if it were some ridiculous joke. "Listen, kid, I don't know who told you this was a good idea, but wheelchairs don't belong at skate parks. This is for real athletes, people who can actually, move." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some looking away in embarrassment while others leaned in with the morbid fascination of witnessing a car crash. Chad's crew snickered on cue, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls like the sound of jackals. "Are you even listening?" Chad continued, stepping closer with his arms crossed. "This isn't some charity event or feel-good movie. Real skaters work for years to earn the right to be here. What exactly makes you think you can just roll up and play pretend?" Jake took a deep, steadying breath, his hands remaining perfectly still on his wheelchair's armrests. "I'm prepared to earn my place here," he replied with quiet dignity. "Just like everyone else." Chad's expression darkened, his casual amusement turning to genuine irritation at Jake's refusal to be intimidated. The small beginner ramp stood barely 3 feet high, a modest concrete slope that experienced skaters barely noticed as they flew past toward more challenging obstacles. For Jake, it represented his first public test, the moment where months of secret garage training would either validate his dreams or expose them as foolish fantasy. Word spread quickly through the park that the wheelchair kid was actually going to try something. Skaters abandoned their own sessions, drawn by the irresistible spectacle of impending failure. They formed a loose semicircle around the ramp, some sitting on their boards, others leaning against railings, all wearing expressions of amused anticipation. "This should be good," someone muttered from the back of the crowd. $10 says he doesn't even make it up the ramp." Another voice called out, earning a few cruel chuckles. Chad and his crew positioned themselves front and center, Chad's phone already out and recording. "This is gonna be YouTube gold," he announced loud enough for Jake to hear. "Wheelchair fails are always good for a laugh." Jake ignored the commentary, focusing on the familiar weight and balance of his modified chair. His hands found their grip positions automatically, muscle memory taking over as he positioned himself at the base of the ramp. The concrete stretched upward like a mountain, though he knew it was barely a hill compared to what he'd practiced on in his garage. He pushed off with controlled power, his specialized wheels gripping the smooth concrete as he rolled up the incline. The angle felt different from his homemade ramps, but his body adjusted instinctively. At the lip of the ramp, Jake compressed slightly and then extended upward, launching his wheelchair cleanly into the air. For one perfect moment, he hung suspended above the concrete, his chair rotating slightly before touching down on the transition with a solid thunk. He carved smoothly back down the ramp, rolled across the flat bottom, and came to a controlled stop. The crowd fell silent for exactly 3 seconds before the reactions exploded in all directions. "Holy crap, did you see that?" a younger skater whispered in genuine amazement. "Not bad," admitted a girl with green hair, nodding with grudging respect. But Chad's voice cut through any growing appreciation. "Big deal." "He went up a baby ramp," he announced with exaggerated boredom. "My little sister could do that on her scooter. You want to impress us? Try something that actually takes skill." The crowd's brief moment of surprise faded back into skepticism, but Jake caught the eyes of a few skaters who looked at him with something that hadn't been there before. Third, curiosity instead of dismissal. Chad wasn't satisfied with Jake's small success. If anything, the fact that the wheelchair kid had actually managed to complete a basic maneuver only fueled his irritation. As Jake rolled toward another section of the park, Chad and his crew deliberately positioned themselves in his path, forming a human wall of expensive sneakers and crossed arms. "Where do you think you're going?" Chad demanded, his voice dripping with false authority. "Just because you managed one little trick doesn't mean you get free run of the place." Tyler, Chad's closest follower, stepped forward with a malicious grin. "Maybe we should set up some special parking spaces for you. Handicapped spots." The joke earned snickers from the crew, their laughter sharp and deliberately loud enough to carry across the park. Or we could install some wheelchair ramps, Marcus added, gesturing mockingly at the existing skate infrastructure. Oh, wait. Those are for real skaters, not wannabes playing pretend. Jake remained seated calmly in his chair, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrests. I'm just trying to practice, he said evenly. Same as everyone else. Practice what exactly? Chad shot back, circling Jake's wheelchair like a predator sizing up prey. Face it, kid. Some activities just aren't meant for people in your condition. Maybe you should try something more appropriate. Chess club? Library volunteering? I hear they need help organizing books on the bottom shelves. The crew erupted in cruel laughter, feeding off their leader's cruelty. Devon pulled out his phone and started filming. This is going straight to social media, he announced. Wheelchair kid thinks he's Tony Hawk. Around the edges of the confrontation, some of the younger skaters shifted uncomfortably. A 13-year-old named Alex looked down at his shoes. His face flushed with embarrassment at the display. Two middle school girls whispered to each other, clearly disturbed by the escalating harassment. But none of them spoke up. The social hierarchy of the skate park was ironclad. Challenging Chad meant becoming his next target. Look, Wheels, Chad continued, his voice growing harsher. I'm trying to help you out here. This place isn't safe for someone like you. Real skaters move fast, take risks, push limits. What happens when somebody crashes into you? What happens when you get hurt? We don't need that liability. He leaned down closer to Jake's face, his expression shifting from mocking to genuinely menacing. So here's some friendly advice. Find yourself a nice, quiet sidewalk somewhere and stick to what you're built for. Leave the extreme sports to people who can actually handle them. The park had gone eerily quiet. Every eye focused on the confrontation, waiting to see if the wheelchair kid would finally break under the pressure. Retry. Mia Rodriguez had been watching the harassment unfold from across the park, her jaw clenching tighter with each cruel comment. At 16, she was one of the few female skaters who'd earned genuine respect at Riverside, known for her fearless approach to vert skating and her complete intolerance for bullies. Her long black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her worn jeans and faded band t-shirt marked her as someone who cared more about substance than style. That's enough, Chad, she called out, pushing through the crowd with her skateboard tucked under her arm. The authority in her voice cut through the tension like a blade, causing several of Chad's followers to step back instinctively. Chad spun around, his expression shifting to annoyed surprise. Stay out of this, Mia. This doesn't concern you. Actually, it does. She positioned herself directly between Chad and Jake, her dark eyes flashing with barely controlled anger. Since when do we judge skaters by what they roll on instead of what they can do? Last time I checked, this park was about skill and heart, not about who fits your narrow definition of normal. Tyler tried to interject with a smirk. Come on, Mia, be realistic. He's in a wheelchair. What's he gonna do, roll around in circles? Mia's gaze snapped to Tyler with withering intensity. Did you even watch what he just did? Because I saw someone land a clean air transition on his first try. How'd your first day here go, Tyler? Didn't you spend 3 hours trying to drop in without falling on your face? A few younger skaters snickered, remembering Tyler's embarrassing early sessions, and his confident smirk faltered. Look at his setup. Mia continued, gesturing toward Jake's modified wheelchair. Those aren't standard components. This guy's engineered something custom, which means he's serious about this. More serious than half the posers who show up here with expensive boards and no commitment. Chad's voice grew dangerous. Careful, Mia. You're starting to sound like one of those bleeding heart activists. Next, you'll be demanding we install participation trophy cases. And you're starting to sound like every closed-minded idiot who told me girls couldn't skate vert. Mia shot back without hesitation. Remember when you said that? Right before I showed you up on the 12-foot halfpipe? The crowd stirred at the reference to that legendary moment when Mia had silenced Chad's sexist comments by landing tricks he could only dream of attempting. She turned to Jake, her expression softening but remaining determined. I'm Mia. Don't let these jerks discourage you. Anyone can see you've put serious work into this. Her eyes studied his wheelchair's modifications with genuine interest. Those bearing upgrades alone probably cost more than Chad's entire setup. "Thanks," Jake replied quietly. Grateful but aware that Mia's support might cost her socially, Chad's crew began muttering among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with their leader being challenged so directly, especially by someone whose skating credentials they couldn't question. Emboldened by Mia's support and determined to prove he belonged, Jake decided to attempt something more ambitious than the small beginner ramp. Across the park stood a 6-foot quarterpipe, its steep concrete walls worn smooth by years of wheels and bodies. It was a significant step up from his first attempt, but Jake had practiced similar heights in his garage. He felt ready. "You sure about this?" Mia asked quietly, recognizing the challenging nature of what Jake was considering. Maybe work up to it gradually? But Jake was focused, his competitive instincts overriding caution. The whispers and stares had followed him all afternoon, and he needed to silence the doubters with something undeniable. "I've got this," he assured her, rolling toward the quarterpipe with renewed determination. Chad noticed the movement immediately. "Oh, this is perfect," he announced to his crew, pulling out his phone and hitting record. "The wheelchair wonder is going for the big leagues. This is definitely going viral." Devin and Marcus flanked him, their own phones out, creating multiple angles of what they expected to be Jake's humiliating failure. Other skaters gathered as word spread that something significant was about to happen. Jake positioned himself at the bottom of the transition, studying the steep concrete wall that curved up toward the sky. His hands found their familiar grip positions, and he began building speed across the flat bottom. The approach felt good, his specialized wheels tracking smoothly over the concrete. He hit the transition with solid momentum and began climbing the wall. Everything felt right until he reached the crucial moment where he needed to compress and extend for the aerial maneuver. Something went wrong with his timing. Perhaps the pressure of the crowd. Perhaps the different angle of this ramp compared to his garage setup. Instead of launching cleanly into the air, Jake's wheelchair caught the lip awkwardly. Time seemed to slow as his chair tilted beyond the point of recovery. Jake felt himself separating from his wheelchair, his body tumbling through the air in a chaotic spiral. He crashed hard onto the concrete, his modified chair clattering down beside him in a symphony of scraping metal and spinning wheels. The silence lasted exactly 2 heartbeats before Chad's group exploded into cruel laughter. "Did you get that?" Chad shouted, his phone still recording as Jake lay stunned on the concrete. "That's gonna get 1 million views. Wheelchair epic fail. Dude just went full yard sale," Tyler added, using skater slang for a spectacular crash. The crew was beside themselves with glee, their phones capturing every angle of Jake's embarrassing fall. Devin was already uploading to social media. "This is comedy gold. Kid thought he was gonna fly." Jake slowly pushed himself up on his elbows, checking for injuries while trying to process what had gone wrong. His wheelchair lay on its side several feet away, one wheel still spinning mockingly. Jake lay on the cold concrete, his body aching from the fall, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight of humiliation pressing down on his chest. The laughter echoed off the concrete walls like a chorus of judgment, each cruel chuckle another nail in the coffin of his dreams. His modified wheelchair sat overturned beside him, looking as defeated and broken as he felt. "Maybe I should just go home," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible over the continuing mockery. Every assumption they'd made about him seemed to be proving true. Maybe Chad was right. Maybe wheelchairs didn't belong at skate parks. Maybe some barriers couldn't be broken, no matter how desperately you wanted to break them. He could see his mother's car parked beyond the fence. Could imagine himself rolling away from this place forever, never to return. The garage training sessions would become just another abandoned dream, another reminder of limitations he couldn't overcome. The thought of facing Emma tonight, of seeing the disappointment in her eyes when he told her he'd failed, made his stomach twist with shame. But then, through the fog of self-doubt, he heard a voice that had been silent for 2 years. His grandfather's voice, strong and unwavering, speaking the words that had carried Jake through countless childhood defeats. "Falls don't define you, Jacob," the old man had said during Jake's early basketball struggles. Getting back up does. Every champion you'll ever admire has tasted dirt more times than they care to remember. The difference between champions and quitters isn't that champions don't fall. It's that they refuse to stay down. I refuse to stay down. Grandpa Henry had been gone for 2 years now, taken by cancer just months before Jake's accident. But his words lived on, burned into Jake's memory like sacred text. The old man had never met a challenge he wouldn't face, never accepted defeat as permanent. Jake pressed his palms against the concrete and pushed himself into a sitting position. The laughter was still there, the phone still recording, but something fundamental had shifted in his mindset. This wasn't about proving anything to Chad or the crowd anymore. This was about honoring the man who'd taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was action in spite of fear. With deliberate movements, Jake crawled to his overturned wheelchair and began the process of righting it. His hands moved with quiet determination, checking the frame for damage, spinning the wheels to ensure they still functioned properly. Everything seemed intact. "What's he doing?" someone in the crowd whispered. Jake transferred himself back into his chair with practiced efficiency, his jaw set with grim resolve. He wasn't leaving. Not today. Marcus Thompson had been trying to focus on his maintenance duties, replacing worn grip tape on the park's rail system. But the escalating confrontation kept drawing his attention. As the 32-year-old park supervisor, he'd seen plenty of conflicts over the years, territorial disputes, ego clashes, the usual teenage drama that came with competitive sports. But this felt different, uglier, and it made his stomach turn with familiar anger. Marcus knew something about being underestimated. 15 years ago, he'd been one of the top Paralympic wheelchair racers in the world, holding 3 gold medals and 2 world records, before a shoulder injury ended his competitive career. He'd learned to recognize the look in someone's eyes when they saw his prosthetic leg. I have that mixture of pity, discomfort, and assumption that he was somehow less capable than he appeared. But as Marcus watched Jake methodically check his wheelchair after the fall, something caught his attention that made him stop his repair work entirely. Those weren't standard wheelchair components. The frame modifications, the specialized bearings, the custom footrests and grips. This was the work of someone who understood both engineering and extreme athletics. Marcus moved closer, studying Jake's setup with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years perfecting adaptive sports equipment. The wheelchair's geometry was specifically designed for dynamic movement, its center of gravity carefully calculated for aerial maneuvers. The reinforcement points showed evidence of serious impact testing. This wasn't some kid playing around with a hospital wheelchair. AG1. This was a serious athlete with serious equipment. "Interesting modifications," Marcus said quietly, approaching Jake as the crowd's attention began to drift elsewhere. His voice carried the authority of someone who belonged at the park, and several nearby skaters glanced over curiously. Jake looked up, recognizing the park employee uniform but noting something different in Marcus's expression. "Captains. Respect rather than pity." "Thanks," he replied cautiously. "I've been working on the design for months." Marcus crouched down to examine the wheelchair more closely, his experienced eyes cataloging every custom detail. "Those are competition-grade bearings, and this frame reinforcement pattern." He looked up at Jake with growing interest. "You've done some serious homework. This is Paralympic-level engineering." For the first time all day, Jake felt someone truly seeing his wheelchair for what it was. It's not a limitation, but a tool of possibility. Chad's voice carried over from nearby. "Great." Now, the janitor's encouraging him. Marcus stood slowly, his expression hardening as he turned toward Chad, with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced down much tougher opponents than entitled teenagers. Over the next hour, something remarkable began to happen at Riverside Skate Park. While Chad and his core followers maintained their hostile stance, Jake's quiet persistence and genuine character started to chip away at the broader crowd's skepticism. He didn't seek attention or make grand gestures, and simply. He simply continued practicing, falling, getting up, and trying again with unwavering determination. The turning point came when 10-year-old Tommy Martinez froze at the top of a small ramp, his new skateboard trembling beneath his feet. The young boy had been building courage all afternoon, but when the moment came to drop in, fear paralyzed him completely. Other skaters walked past, focused on their own sessions, but Jake noticed the kid's distress. "Hey!" Jake called out gently, rolling over to the base of the ramp. "First time dropping in?" Tommy nodded miserably, his knuckles white as he gripped his board. "I can't do it. Everyone's watching, and I'm gonna mess up. You know what helped me when I was scared?" Jake asked, his voice calm and encouraging. "I stopped thinking about everyone else and just focused on the feeling of rolling. Close your eyes for a second. Feel the board under your feet. Trust that it wants to roll. Gall. That's what it's designed for." Tommy followed Jake's advice, his breathing slowing as he centered himself. "Now," Jake continued, "I'm going to be right here when you come down. You're not alone in this." The boy opened his eyes, looked at Jake's reassuring smile, and finally committed. He dropped into the ramp with shaky but successful form, rolling straight toward Jake, who caught him with steady hands and a proud grin. "That was awesome!" Jake exclaimed, and Tommy's face lit up with pure joy. The exchange hadn't gone unnoticed. Several younger skaters who'd been watching began to see Jake differently. Here was someone who'd been publicly humiliated just an hour earlier, yet he'd taken time to help a frightened kid when no one else bothered. "That was really cool," whispered Sarah, a 13-year-old girl with pink streaks in her hair. "The way he helped Tommy." Alex, the boy who'd looked uncomfortable during Chad's earlier harassment, nodded in agreement. "Maybe he's not so different from us." Even some of the older teenagers began questioning their initial assumptions. Jake's genuine kindness, combined with his obvious technical knowledge and refusal to give up, painted a picture that didn't match the helpless victim narrative Chad had been pushing. The park's social dynamics were shifting. Invisible battle lines being drawn between those who saw strength in Jake's character and those who remained committed to exclusion. Chad had been watching Jake's gradual acceptance among the younger skaters with growing fury. Every small gesture of kindness, every encouraging word Jake offered to other kids, every moment of respect he earned, chipped away at Chad's narrative of superiority. When he saw several teenagers actually cheering for Jake's latest successful run, something inside him snapped. "All right, enough of this feel-good nonsense," Chad announced loudly, striding to the center of the park's main bowl, where his voice would carry to every corner. "Everyone gather around. We need to have a serious conversation about safety." His commanding tone drew skaters from across the park like a magnet. Within minutes, nearly 40 people had formed a large circle, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Chad positioned himself at the center like a prosecutor addressing a jury, his expression grave and authoritative. "Look, I've tried to be nice about this," he began, his voice carrying the false concern of someone pretending to care. "I've tried to let this kid have his fun and learn his lesson the easy way. But now I'm worried we're heading toward a real disaster." Jake sat quietly in his wheelchair at the edge of the crowd, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. Marcus Thompson had moved closer, his jaw clenched with barely contained anger at what he sensed was coming. "Think about it logically," Chad continued, warming to his performance. "Skate parks are dangerous places. We've got people flying through the air at high speeds, landing tricks that require split-second timing, moving in patterns that take years to predict. Now, add someone who can't move quickly, can't get out of the way, can't react like the rest of us. What happens when a real skater comes down a ramp and finds a wheelchair blocking the line?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Chad's words found their mark. Some nodded uncertainly, genuinely concerned about the safety implications he was raising. "I'm not trying to be mean," Chad said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "But facts are facts. Disabled people belong in environments designed for their limitations. This place is for athletes who can handle the risks, who won't endanger themselves or others by pretending to be something they're not." The crowd grew uncomfortable as Chad's mask of reasonableness slipped away, revealing the ugly prejudice beneath. "So here's what's going to happen," Chad announced with finality. "You're going to pack up your special wheelchair and find somewhere more appropriate to play. Before someone gets seriously hurt, and this park gets shut down because we were too politically correct to face reality. The silence that followed was deafening, every person present recognizing they were witnessing something that would define them all. Jake sat perfectly still for a long moment, letting Chad's words hang in the air like poison. The crowd waited, expecting him to crumble under the pressure, to roll away in defeat with his head down and his dreams shattered. But when Jake finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet strength that cut through the tension like a blade. "You're right about one thing, Chad," Jake said, rolling forward so everyone could hear him clearly. "This place is for athletes who can handle the risks. People who've put in the work, who understand their equipment, who respect the sport enough to push boundaries." He gestured to his modified wheelchair with obvious pride. "These aren't standard components. I've spent months engineering every detail. Titanium reinforcements that can handle impacts you wouldn't believe. Custom bearings rated for speeds that would terrify most people, and a suspension system that absorbs landings from heights that would destroy regular equipment." The crowd leaned in despite themselves, drawn by Jake's technical expertise and unwavering confidence. "You think I'm dangerous because I can't move like you?" Jake continued, his eyes never leaving Chad's face. "I've calculated the physics of every trick I attempt. I know the exact force loads on my equipment. I understand momentum, rotation, and impact better than half the people here because I have to. Because getting it wrong means more than just a scraped knee." Marcus Thompson watched with growing amazement, recognizing the mindset of a true competitor emerging from beneath Jake's quiet exterior. "You want to talk about safety?" Jake asked, positioning his wheelchair at the base of the park's most intimidating feature, a 12-foot half-pipe that even experienced skaters approached with caution. "Then let me show you what real preparation looks like." The crowd shifted nervously as they realized Jake was positioning himself for something far beyond anything they'd seen him attempt. This wasn't the small ramp he'd conquered earlier. This was serious terrain that demanded serious skill. "Jake!" Mia called out, genuine concern in her voice. "You don't have to prove anything to these jerks." But Jake was already in the zone, his hands finding their grip positions with practiced precision. The months of garage training, the countless calculations, the endless repetitions, everything had been building toward this moment. "What's he doing?" someone whispered. Jake looked up at the crowd one final time, his eyes burning with quiet determination. "I'm about to show you something that's never been done before." The setup for the backflip. Jake's internal monologue about overcoming fear and proving that limitations are often self-imposed. The crowd falls silent as they realize something significant is about to happen. Jake positioned his wheelchair at the edge of the 12-foot half-pipe, the massive concrete wall stretching upward like a monument to human ambition and gravity-defying dreams. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady on the push rims. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Months of secret training, countless failures, and endless calculations all compressed into the next 60 seconds. The crowd fell into an eerie silence as they began to understand the magnitude of what Jake was attempting. Even Chad's smirk faltered as he watched Jake's methodical preparation, the quiet confidence radiating from someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times in private. "Fear is just information," Jake thought, remembering his grandfather's voice. "It tells you what matters, what's at stake, but it doesn't get to make the decisions." He closed his eyes and visualized the sequence one final time. The approach speed had to be perfect. Too slow, and he wouldn't generate enough vertical lift. Too fast, and he'd overshoot the landing. The compression at the bottom of the transition, the explosive extension at the lip, the precise timing of the rotation initiation. Every element had been calculated, practiced, refined, until it lived in his muscle memory. Jake opened his eyes and looked up at the crowd one more time. Their faces showed a mixture of anticipation, fear, and dawning realization that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Some looked genuinely concerned for his safety. Others, like Chad, wore expressions of barely concealed hope that Jake would fail spectacularly. But Jake wasn't doing this for them anymore. He was doing it for every person who'd ever been told their dreams were too big, their limitations too real, their differences too significant to overcome. He was doing it for the 10-year-old version of himself who'd believed anything was possible. And for Emma, who still believed that about him, limitations are often self-imposed, he reminded himself. The biggest barriers exist in our minds, not in our bodies. Jake took one final breath, feeling the familiar weight and balance of his modified wheelchair beneath him. This machine wasn't his limitation. It was his wings. The park held its collective breath as Jake began his approach, rolling backward to build momentum for what would either be triumph or catastrophe. Jake pushed backward up the opposite wall of the halfpipe, building momentum with each powerful stroke of his arms. The concrete curved beneath his wheels like a launching pad, physics and determination combining into something that transcended the ordinary. At the peak of his backward climb, he compressed his body, coiling like a spring loaded with months of preparation and a lifetime of dreams. Then he dropped. Gravity seized him and his modified wheelchair, pulling them down the curved wall with increasing velocity. The wind rushed past his face as the bottom of the transition approached at breathtaking speed. Jake's specialized bearings hummed against the smooth concrete, his reinforced frame absorbing the tremendous forces building with each passing millisecond. At the exact moment his calculations had predicted, Jake hit the opposite lip of the halfpipe. He compressed his body one final time and then exploded upward with every ounce of strength in his core and arms. The wheelchair launched into the air, separating from the concrete in a perfect arc of defiance against gravity and expectation. For a heartbeat, Jake hung suspended 12 feet above the concrete. The park spread below him like a miniature kingdom. Then he initiated the rotation, tucking his body tight as his wheelchair began its backward revolution through empty space. The world spun around him in a blur of concrete and sky, his custom-engineered chair rotating as precisely as any gymnast's body. One complete revolution. The physics were perfect, the timing flawless, the execution born from hundreds of hours of secret practice and unwavering faith in the possible. Jake spotted his landing, extended his body, and prepared for impact. His wheelchair touched down on the transition exactly where he'd calculated it would, the reinforced frame absorbing the tremendous forces with engineered precision. He carved smoothly down the wall, across the bottom, and up the opposite side in one fluid motion of pure athletic poetry. The crowd exploded. The silence that had gripped the park for those eternal seconds shattered into a cacophony of disbelief, amazement, and pure joy. Skaters jumped to their feet, their voices joining in a roar that echoed off the concrete walls like thunder. Phones that had been recording in anticipation of failure now captured something that would indeed go viral. But for all the right reasons. Did that just happen? Someone screamed over the noise. "That was impossible!" Another voice shouted, the word impossible spoken with reverence rather than dismissal. Even Chad stood frozen, his mouth hanging open, his carefully constructed worldview cracking like glass. Jake rolled to a stop at the bottom of the halfpipe, his chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline, his face glowing with the quiet satisfaction of proving that some barriers existed only in people's minds. Chad Stevens stood frozen in complete disbelief, his phone hanging limply in his hand, still recording the impossible thing he'd just witnessed. His carefully constructed reality had just been shattered by a 16-year-old kid who defied every assumption, every prejudice, every limitation Chad had tried to impose. The arrogant smirk that had defined his face all afternoon was gone, replaced by the stunned expression of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed. That's not possible," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the erupting celebration around him. His crew stood equally speechless, their earlier mockery dying in their throats as they struggled to process what they'd seen. The crowd had transformed completely. Where once there had been skepticism and cruel laughter, now there was pure electric excitement. Skaters who'd never spoken Jake's name were suddenly shouting it with admiration. The younger kids who'd watched him help Tommy were jumping up and down, their faces glowing with inspiration and possibility. "Someone please tell me you got that on video!" Sarah screamed, her pink-streaked hair flying as she bounced with excitement. "I got it!" shouted Alex, his phone shaking in his trembling hands. "I got the whole thing! This is incredible." Multiple phones had captured different angles of the historic moment. the footage already being uploaded to social media platforms, where it would soon explode across the internet. But in this moment, the viral potential was secondary to the pure human drama unfolding in real time. Mia Rodriguez was the first to reach Jake, her skateboard clattering to the ground as she rushed toward him with tears streaming down her face. "Jake! Oh my God, Jake!" She threw her arms around his shoulders, her voice cracking with emotion. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. You just made history!" Marcus Thompson was right behind her, his professional composure completely abandoned as he approached with undisguised awe. 30 years in adaptive sports," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "And I've never seen anything like that. Kid, you just redefined what's possible." The tide had completely turned. Every person who doubted, dismissed, or ridiculed Jake now stood witness to something that would haunt their assumptions forever. The quiet kid in the modified wheelchair had just pulled off a feat that most able-bodied skaters couldn't dream of attempting, let alone executing with such flawless precision. Tommy Martinez pushed through the crowd, his young face beaming with hero worship. "That was amazing! You're like a superhero!" Jake sat in his wheelchair, still catching his breath, but his eyes shining with quiet triumph as he looked around at faces that now showed respect instead of pity, admiration instead of mockery. Within 3 hours of Alex uploading the video to social media, Jake Matthews had become an internet phenomenon. The clip of his perfect backflip spread across platforms like wildfire, accumulating millions of views as it jumped from Instagram to TikTok to Twitter to YouTube. The comment sections exploded with amazement, inspiration, and disbelief from viewers around the world who couldn't quite process what they were seeing. Wheelchair backflip. This changes everything. Read the most popular repost, which had already garnered 2 million views and was climbing rapidly. The footage, captured from multiple angles by different phones, showed Jake's flawless execution from every perspective, leaving no room for doubt about the authenticity of his achievement. Major news outlets picked up the story before midnight. ESPN featured the video on SportsCenter with the headline, "Redefining Possible. Teens Wheelchair Backflip Stuns Skate Community." CNN ran a segment called "Viral Video Shows the Power of Determination." Local news stations scrambled to get the first exclusive interview with overnight sensation from their own backyard. Jake's phone, which had been quietly charging in his backpack during the park session, now buzzed incessantly with notifications. His social media accounts, previously followed by only family and a few school friends, gained thousands of new followers every hour. The messages poured in from around the globe, disabled athletes sharing their own stories, parents of disabled children expressing gratitude for the inspiration, and established extreme sports figures offering respect and recognition. "Dude, I've been skating for 15 years, and I can't do what you just did," wrote Tony Hawk himself, his verified comment sparking another wave of viral attention. "Absolutely incredible. You've just changed the game forever." Paralympic athletes from multiple disciplines reached out with encouragement and solidarity. Wheelchair racing champion David Weir posted, "This is what we've been talking about. No limits, only possibilities. Well done, young man." The business inquiries arrived almost as quickly as the praise. Red Bull's Extreme Sports division sent a formal email before dawn. GoPro wanted to discuss a sponsorship deal. Multiple wheelchair manufacturers offered partnerships to help develop Jake's innovative modifications for broader distribution. Sarah Matthews found herself fielding calls from morning show producers, documentary filmmakers, and agents wanting to represent her son. Good Morning America wants him on next Tuesday, she told her husband David, who sat staring at his laptop screen in bewilderment as the view counter on Jake's video climbed past 5 million. Most importantly, the video was inspiring exactly the audience Jake had hoped to reach. Disabled young people around the world were sharing the clip with captions like, "If he can do this, what can I do?" and "No more excuses, time to chase my dreams." The quiet kid who'd been mocked at a skate park that afternoon had become a global symbol of possibility by bedtime. 2 days after the video exploded across the internet, Chad Stevens sat alone in his car outside Riverside Skate Park, staring at his phone screen where Jake's Backflip played on repeat. He'd watched it hundreds of times now, each viewing driving the knife of humiliation deeper into his conscience. The comments section had become his personal hell. Thousands of people calling him out by name, labeling him a bully, a bigot, everything he'd never wanted to be, but had somehow become. His girlfriend had broken up with him that morning. "I can't be with someone who treats people like that," she'd said, her voice filled with disappointment that cut deeper than anger. His own crew had distanced themselves, suddenly finding excuses to avoid him as the social media backlash intensified. But it wasn't the public shame that kept Chad awake at night. It was the memory of Jake's face, the quiet dignity he'd maintained even when Chad had tried to break his spirit. The grace he'd shown in the face of cruelty he hadn't deserved. Chad replayed every cruel word he'd spoken, every mocking laugh, every moment where he'd chosen cruelty over kindness. When Jake arrived at the park that afternoon for his first return since the viral moment, Chad was waiting. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by the uncertain posture of someone who'd lost everything he thought defined him. "Jake," he called out softly, his voice barely audible. Can I talk to you for a minute?" Jake paused, studying Chad's face with careful eyes. There was no anger there, no satisfaction at seeing his former tormentor brought low, only cautious curiosity. "I need to apologize," Chad began, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "Not because everyone's watching, not because my reputation's destroyed, because I was wrong. About everything." His voice cracked with genuine emotion. "I spent so much time worrying about who belonged and who didn't that I forgot what really matters. You showed more courage in 5 minutes than I've shown in my entire life, and I tried to destroy you for it." Jake listened quietly, recognizing something he'd never heard from Chad before. Authenticity. "I don't expect forgiveness," Chad continued. "I just wanted you to know that watching you succeed didn't just humble me. It changed me. You made me see that the only limits that really matter are the ones we put on ourselves." Jake extended his hand. "Everyone deserves a second chance to be better. And for—" Chad shook it gratefully, understanding that his real education was just beginning. 6 months later, Riverside Skate Park had transformed into something unrecognizable from the exclusive, judgmental place it had once been. Bright banners announced adaptive skate workshops every Saturday, while colorful murals celebrating diversity in action sports decorated the walls. The concrete bowls that had once echoed with cruel laughter now rang with encouragement and celebration of every small victory. Jake Matthews rolled through the park wearing his official Red Bull jersey, his modified wheelchair now sporting professional sponsor decals and cutting-edge technology developed in partnership with leading manufacturers. The shy teenager who'd faced mockery had evolved into a confident athlete whose Instagram following had grown to over 2 million people. His signature backflip had been featured in commercials, documentaries, and magazine covers around the world. "Remember, it's not about the size of the trick," Jake called out to a group of young adaptive athletes gathered around him during the Saturday workshop. "It's about pushing your personal limits and supporting each other through the process." Among his most dedicated students was 8-year-old Maria Santos, who'd been born with spina bifida and had traveled from 3 states away to learn from her hero. Her face glowed with determination as she practiced basic maneuvers on her own modified chair, a design inspired by Jake's engineering innovations. What surprised visitors most wasn't Jake's transformation into a professional athlete, but the presence of Chad Stevens as his co-instructor. The former bully now wore the same workshop t-shirt as Jake, his role as an inclusion advocate earning respect he'd never achieved through intimidation. Chad had become passionate about dismantling the barriers he'd once helped create. "The hardest part isn't learning the tricks," Chad explained to a group of able-bodied volunteers helping with the workshop. "It's unlearning the assumptions we make about what people can and can't do. I spent years being the problem instead of being part of the solution." Marcus Thompson, now serving as the program director, watched with pride as former enemies worked side by side to create opportunities for the next generation of adaptive athletes. The park had received national recognition for its inclusion programs, drawing visitors from across the country who wanted to replicate their success. 6 months ago, this place was about exclusion. Marcus reflected to a documentary crew filming the workshop. Now it's about expanding the definition of possible. That transformation started with one kid who refused to accept the limitations others tried to place on him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concrete as Jake prepared to demonstrate his famous backflip for the gathered crowd, the same trick that had changed everything for everyone who witnessed it. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please, double-check responses.